I'm joined now by Michael Eason, Dr. Michael Eason AM. He's a company director and someone who's held many positions in the Australian Labor Party, the Labor movement in this country, been involved as a contributor, as a participant in Labor politics. And he's recently written an essay for a new book published by Connor Court. It's called The Right Stuff, RITE, and it's all about how the Labor Party can re-engage with conservatives and even Christians like myself. And I'm fascinated by this. I've read Michael's chapter, his contribution to the book about how it can engage people of faith. And I'm really pleased to say he's joining me here today on the Lyle Shelton Show. Welcome, Dr. Eason.
Thank you very much, Lyle. Call me Michael.
Thanks very much, Michael. Well, Michael, as I said in the introduction, I'm fascinated by this book. Why should people of faith look to try and re-engage with the Labor Party when at this very moment we've got the Daniel Andrews government in Victoria with a bill before the Parliament to jail people for 10 years if they pray for someone who asks for it?
Well, I'm not familiar with that legislation, but that's obviously outrageous if that's what they're doing. My article, which is headed Faithful and Labor, What Labor Ignores at Its Peril, is a plea to the Labor Party to take people of faith with respect and to actually embrace the tradition that led to the formation of the Labor Party, because there would be no Labor Party in this country without religious people having decided that there was a need for such a political party. And I think we've moved away from a lot of those traditions that motivated the Labor Party at the beginning. And so people of faith are, in many instances, feeling uncomfortable with the Labor Party. And I think that's the party's fault. And therefore, there needs to be a rethink.
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree with you more, Michael. And I'm sorry, that was a fairly rugged first question, but I'd like to come back to the Daniel Andrews legislation in a moment, because it's really important, and almost every Christian in the country is animated by this. But I agree with you. In my formative years, I looked very closely at the Labor Party. I was involved in student politics at the University of Queensland, and most of my colleagues were members of the Australian Labor Party. And I'm well aware of the Christian roots of the party through Methodism and Presbyterianism, people who were really fighting for social justice, quite rightly, against the exploitation of companies, of workers, particularly at the end of the Industrial Revolution.
Exactly right. And I think there are many people who are religious who feel, I want to support the Labor Party, but I don't think I can. They feel that there's a clash between their personal convictions and what they see as the idealistic and worthy social objectives of the Labor Party. They see there's a disconnect there. Now, of course, many people of religious faith embrace the Labor Party, feel like there isn't a contradiction, but I think there has been this chasm that has opened up. And for me, it's been an eye-opener to meet a number of people of evangelical faith, as well as what I'm more used to, which is in the Catholic tradition, who tell me very bluntly that they can't support the Labor Party. And I don't find most of the people I talk to be fanatical or unreasonable. And therefore, I wanted to write this article, this essay that's been published, to say to my colleagues in the Labor Party, guys and girls, let's think about how we're appearing to be. And maybe it's not only appearance, it's substance that need to be revisited. So it's a plea to take people of religious conviction seriously and to ensure that this disconnect is mended. And until it is, I think many people of Christian religious conviction in particular will feel that they can't embrace the Labor Party. And I think that's a great tragedy because a true, broad and welcoming Labor Party would be embracing people of your faith and those that you inspire, and of course are inspired by the teachings of Jesus Christ. And one of the people who I quote in the book, William Spence, who was the founder of the Australian Workers' Union, saw that Labor was implementing the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, and that simple conviction, that noble idealism that motivated the early pioneers is, I think, at the heart of what I see the Labor Party as standing for. And I think modern Labor need to understand that and engage in a dialogue with itself and with people outside of the party to ensure that we can join hands. And that doesn't mean that all Christians should support the Labor Party or any particular party, but all major parties in Australia should be welcoming, respecting, embracing people of faith.
Look, I couldn't agree more, Michael, and I would love it if both sides of politics, could equally make an appeal to people of serious Christian faith. I think, much of the Labor economic narrative does have an appeal to Christians because it's based in Christian social justice. And I think, people of goodwill can, embrace the liberal economic narrative as well. But when it comes to social policy, it's almost like in the last 5 to 10 years, it's become impossible for those of us who hold to a Christian worldview or a socially conservative worldview to support Labor. And I started at the beginning by mentioning, the bill that's currently before the Victorian Parliament about so-called gay conversion therapy. And again, this is, no one in Christendom in Australia is using electric shock treatment or trying to manipulate gay people to convert them. But what this bill does, as I said in the introduction, is if you're someone with gender confusion, you might be a child confused about your gender, and you ask someone, you initiate an interaction, a conversation with someone and ask for a prayer or even a conversation, you can be fined hundreds of thousands of dollars and jailed for 10 years. Now, this is not scaremongering. This is in the legislation. And for many Christians and social conservatives, this is the last straw with the Australian Labor Party.
Well, I haven't seen the legislation, as I've mentioned, and I'm not ducking the point you're making or denying it or anything like that. I'm living in sunny New South Wales where I'm just unfamiliar with what you refer to. But I think you go to the heart of the major issue, a dividing point within Australia, and that is whether honestly held traditional Christian, and for that matter, honestly held and traditionally espoused positions in the Jewish and Muslim and other faiths are to be respected in the political discourse. And in the Labor Party, that takes two aspects. One aspect is whether on moral issues, a conscience vote will be allowed. And secondly, what positions the political party will be adopting and espousing. On the first of those 2 points, I think the Labor Party traditionally has supported a conscience vote on issues of moral questions. And there has been a shift away from that. In Queensland, a few years ago, there was a vote on abortion liberalisation where the Labor Party MPs were whipped, meaning the governing party said everyone has to vote this way, there's no conscience vote. I think there might have been one person who abstained.
Yes, it was Joanne Miller, and she resigned from the party earlier this year, very bitter and disappointed with her treatment by the party, primarily over that issue.
Yes, and I think that is a disgrace. I think it is a disgrace. And I think it is a reason why, despite many good things the Labor Party talked about, that this has become a dividing line. And so I personally believe that there should be more votes on conscience, even beyond questions of moral conviction. I support the kind of approach that the British Labor Party and the politics of the United Kingdom adopt, where political parties allow a lot more flexibility in votes of outside of the hardline position. You must follow this position on this adopted caucus line on every issue. So I do favour a bit more flexibility, and I've argued for that elsewhere.
Michael, it's great to hear you arguing for that flexibility. Just hearkening back to my time, 10 years as a lobbyist with Australian Christian Lobby in Canberra, and we worked very hard with Labor people, and there was a great many who shared our social values, but I saw a progression over time where in the midst of the, what was really an iconic litmus test issue of same-sex marriage, so many in Labor just like lemmings fell over the cliff and rolled over on that issue, to the point where when the plebiscite finally happened and legislation was presented to the Parliament in December 2017, when a whole raft of freedom of speech and freedom of religion amendments were put up, Labor voted against every one of those. And many in the Turnbull cabinet at the time also voted against them. But Labor as a bloc with the Greens voted against every measure to protect freedom of speech. And it just sent a big message to people of faith and people of conservative disposition that they're no longer welcome in the Labor movement.
And I think that viewpoint is disturbing, and it's one reason I wrote my chapter. I have to be honest and say that due to other reasons, I'm no longer in the Labor Party, meaning that I've been a member for 42 years. But one of the positions I hold requires me not to be politically active. But I was asked, could you consider writing this particular article? And I decided it's a plea to the Labor Party more than anything else. But if I am disturbed by the intolerance that has developed. I understand why most people in the community ultimately voted for same-sex marriage and why the Labor Party has a more liberal position on that issue. But I know,
Michael, if Australian people knew what we now know, that freedom of speech and freedom of religion, and that children were going to be indoctrinated compulsorily in schools with radical LGBTIQ, gender fluid education, all this is happening now. Penny Wong, straight after the marriage debate, went after Christian schools with a bill in the Parliament to take away their right to employ staff who believe what the parent community want for their children. That all happened within months of same-sex marriage being passed. How does the Labor Party come back from here and show people or respond to your plea when they've just been so overtly hostile to the wishes of people of faith? And of course, just to add one other thing, I think they paid an electoral price at the last federal election. Chris Bowen and others have acknowledged that they took a bath in Western Sydney because of the anger amongst Christian, Muslim, the Maronite community about their position, particularly on the marriage issue and the encroachment on religious freedom.
I think all of that's right, and I think a lot of this is still to play out. And what I'm saying is that I'm arguing 2 points within the chapter. One is please respect those who might disagree with the mainstream, but legitimately belong in the Labor movement. So that's a plea for respect and tolerance and diversity, particularly diversity, which is a point most people in the Labor Party say they support. But there's a question whether they truly support diversity when it comes to those of honestly held traditional Christian and other religious views. And the second point I'm making is a realpolitik point, and that is, if you're going to exclude the 20% say of the electorate that absolutely diehard support positions of more conservative dispositions on Christian ideas, for example, you will rarely win 50% out of the remaining 80%. So Labor is destined not to win very often if Labor excludes people of faith from feeling that there's a place for them in the broad Labor movement. So I believe the first argument is the winning argument. Respect people of moral conviction who truly belong to the Labor movement. But if that's not convincing enough, think about the real politics. Labor cannot win by excluding people of strongly held religious faith.
I think that's a really good point that you make in the book. You say that Labor only ever wins elections. It's probably true for both sides of politics, but particularly for Labor, by building coalitions. And Kevin Rudd demonstrated that in 2007 when he did go out there and appeal to Christians. And I think, as someone who is an evangelical Christian, I watched that with great interest. And I saw many social justice-minded believers really flock to Labor because there's no doubt social justice is a massive part. It goes to the core of the teachings of Jesus, and a political party enunciating that in public policy has a great attraction. And John Black, the great demographer here in Brisbane, recognised that those people in the Bible Belt seats in Brisbane played a key role in the 2007 Rudd slide. But I think what's transpired now in the last 13 or so years with the hostility by many key Labor figures, including Penny Wong, who said, of me that there's no place in Australia for my views on, children deserving a mother and a father wherever possible. It just makes it really, really hard. And I'm sorry I'm labouring that point, but I love the thesis that you're presenting, but I think it's going to take some strong and courageous voices in the Labor movement to stand up and say, hey, and stand up publicly and say, hey, we need to stop treating people of faith so perniciously.
I agree with you, and particularly on the point about Kevin Rudd. There were a lot of people of evangelical persuasion in particular who began to take the Labor Party seriously when Rudd became the leader and later Prime Minister. I think his demise and the lack of an authentic voice that represents that perspective is not apparent in the Labor Party. And I think that's also an issue with the Democrats in the US, with identity politics. My personal view is that it's amazing that someone as odious as President Trump can almost win. And the reason he almost won the recent election is because many people in the Democratic Party, their traditional supporters, their traditional base, feel that the Democrats have moved well away from them in terms of traditional faith matters. Now, we're a different country from the United States, but I do see parallels where the liberal left party, the Labor Party, the Democrats in the US, know the constituency and do not have people of conservative moral dispositions who are passionate about faith representing them in the parliament. And in the US, 20 to 30% of Democratic supporters believe in the right to life, and yet there's hardly anyone, if anyone anymore, in the Congress who espouses that position. It's a bit higher in Australia in the Labor Party for historical reasons, but it's getting to be like the Democrats in the US. Now, if identity politics is going to define the Labor Party in the future, then it knows the constituency, the catchment area, the electoral catchment area from which Labor can win a majority. So in that real politics sense, and in my view, the good perspective that comes from saying, look, you might disagree with me, or you might be a bit more conservative or a lot more conservative than me on issues of faith and morals and gender and sexuality and all of those things. But by gosh, your view is not a wacko view, it's a traditional view, it's a view I respect. And you're entitled to argue hard for that view, to be respected for it, and to vote according to conscience in the Parliament should you be elected representing the Labor Party. That's the position I've argued for.
Who do you see in the current Labor Party at state or federal level who's willing to say what you just said publicly? And I say that, and I write about this in my book. I went to the last 3 Labor national conferences as an observer, and also to try and have some influence. But I watched the party mock Joe de Bruin, a hero of the Labor movement, because he tried to appeal to them in the way that you're speaking to at least respect people who had a view on marriage. He was mocked and jeered and booed, and of course the party changed its policy, and it's. I think he's the last of those voices. Anthony, I'm thinking of the Anthony Burke. My apologies, who led the debate on euthanasia back in the 90s. He as well. Tony Burke, sorry. Don Farrell, who's often been a great voice. These people have found themselves marginalised on the social issues, and there just doesn't seem to be any public voices who would provide that welcome for people who do hold socially conservative views anymore.
And should that continue, then Labor will find it very hard to win. And I quoted Dick Klugman in the book, who was a former federal member of Parliament, a proud atheist, the founder of the Council for Civil Liberties in New South Wales. And in one of his speeches in the early 80s, I think, he said, actually, the position of people that I disagree with on abortion is one that I totally respect. Life begins at conception. There's a development that lead to the formation of a human person. That is an entirely logical and decent argument to uphold. It's a view based on faith. It's also a view that is a kind view about the formation and development of human life and the protection of human life. And that was a very interesting intervention by him. He didn't vote for the relevant legislation that was put up, but he respected his opponent. I only wish that that perspective was strongly articulated by those who disagree with perspectives that you've been identified with. And I also wish that there were people like Joe de Bruin and Don Farrell and Tony Burke, as he was when he fought against the euthanasia legislation. And I hope he would still adhere to that position, and I have no reason to suspect he wouldn't, even if he's moved a long way on some other issues. But there is a need for the Labor Party not only to say, I respect you and I think you're a decent guy, a person, and people of all different persuasions are welcome. It'd be great to have a few more voices in the Parliament who can articulate that perspective and indicate to the wider electorate, including evangelical and traditional Catholic and other Christian and other religious positions, actually, not only do they respect us, but there are voices that are our voices being heard within the party and elsewhere.
I love what you're saying, Michael, and it reminds me of the days when Kim Beazley was the leader. He was someone who would have agreed with everything that you've just said, and there were many others. But I noticed after 10 years in Canberra as a lobbyist, as I said, working very closely with many Labor MPs, those voices have become dim and become marginalised, and many have changed positions. I'm just wondering whether, at this point in time, it's too late for the Labor Party, and whether another social justice party needs to be formed. Could the Labor movement find itself back in the days of the DLP and the split that happened there in the 1950s? Because there genuinely are people who dislike the conservative economic narrative, but can't embrace Labor with where it's gone on social policy.
I think it's better to reform the Labor Party than to form another party. It's too hard to do the latter anyway. And one point I mentioned in the book is that recently there's been the formation by evangelical within the Labor Party of Christians for Labor. And separately, another group has been formed this year, and that is the Jono Johnson Forum, which is named after a person of great religious faith, respected across the political spectrum, including across everyone within the Labor Party and across to the Conservatives, to the Liberal Party and so on. And Jono was a former member of the Upper House in New South Wales, and he used to have a saying, keep the faith, both of them, meaning be faithful to religion, to your religious conviction, and be faithful to Labor. Keep them both. And so they're interesting developments. Now, I'm an old man compared to the younger people who are involved in forming those organisations, and I've said to them, happy to be involved on the outside, but please, this is your party now, and you need to run the fight and to articulate the viewpoints that need to be heard. So I take some encouragement from those initiatives. It is a long way back, but the beginning is to understand the problem, and hopefully the chapter I've written in this book helps along that path.
No, it certainly does, Michael. I certainly enjoyed reading it, and your mention of Jono Johnson there, I remember meeting him briefly at one of those Labor Party conventions at Darling Harbour before he passed. A friend introduced him to me, and I can see that there were obviously people of great faith in the party, and let's hope that your contribution to the book, The Right Stuff, helps prod the party back in this direction, because I think it's in Australia's interest for both of the major parties to be supportive of people who are of Christian faith and have socially conservative values. So, Dr. Michael Eason, thank you so much for giving up your time to be with me on the Lyle Shelton Show today.
And Lyle, like every other author, thank you for reading what I wrote.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Lyle Shelton Show is a production of The Good Source, hosted by Lyle Shelton. To watch, listen to, or read more content without the SJW PC fact filter, visit goodsource.news. Good, SAUCE.news. Become a Good Source supporter for exclusive access to live and unedited interview recordings, including the conversations before and after the show.